Okay, so our three themes were, we spent quite a lot of time talking about this whole idea of membership versus community. So obviously members are part of the community, but there's also this bigger community that the membership reflects and is part of. So we thought a bit about what does it mean to be a member, and it's really important that membership comes with obligations, but does that mean that there aren't any obligations for community members who aren't members? So there's a sort of tension there, I think. And there are also some constraints in being a membership organisation. We have Emily on our table who noted, and I'm going to get the name of it wrong, but Crossref is a trade association, which means there are some constraints in what, at the moment, what they can and can't do. We also thought there's some questions about how to balance input from the whole community and input from members, which takes priority. Again, there's a lot of overlap there, but how do you balance that? And how do you balance the time you spend with each group of the community? So is the balance right between, for example, large publishers and small publishers, sponsors, prospective publishers, metadata and so on? So we're not sure that at the moment that's completely right, whether it's scalable, could some more of that sort of support time be automated? And this feeds into the second point, which is around vision. And although maybe the balance of time may be right for Crossref as it is now or has been, is it right for where Crossref wants to get to? But to answer that question, Crossref needs to have a clear vision, which will define the goals so that you then know what the community is and what you're trying to do with that. And that, in turn, will define the committees and the makeup of the committees. And we also had a point here about the board makeup, which is that there's absolutely no representation from Asia Pacific at the moment. And given that that is part of who Crossref is now and wants to be in the future, that seems like a big omission to us. And then we also wanted to note that there's a sort of question around what the value of the membership is, and that this again is looking to the future. What value do members feel they get from membership now, and is that the same as what we expect that they will get in the future, and can we be clearer about that?
In this group, we also had a discussion on small versus large, like in the previous group. Clear definitions are needed and also clearly translated in what that means for the representation. Is one member, one vote still logical in an organization with 11,000 members? There are a lot of other organizations where it depends on the stake that a certain organization has in the overall member organization. There was a discussion on Global North versus Global South, or Global West versus Global East. It translated into possible solutions in terms of different member categories, maybe also different chapters within the organizations, which can be regional, national, language-based, or membership type-based. And the discussion on staff time, it was unclear what was exactly in those bars of the graph. If you have an organization of 11,000 members, probably a lot of time also goes in simple things like renewals and getting the membership fees in, which seems a bit of a waste of time. In general, the overall conclusion was it's a pity that so much in the graph is focused on blue activities and less on yellow. Maybe the usage of all the metadata should become more important after 20 years than getting the input right, because the input hopefully could be more automated.
So in the question of how is Crossref positioned for the future, we saw one theme of inclusivity and expansion. So we saw it as very positive that there's been such a growth in small members, but there could be more of a push to include other content providers like research institutions, funders, and metadata users. Could also be more geographically inclusive. Humanities and social sciences could play a bigger role. There's, with the work that's being done on books, that's certainly steps are being taken in that direction, but that's something that could definitely be expanded. And the new governance change is the revenue really the best split for the board? So there's 8 seats that are reserved for the biggest. That doesn't leave many seats for all of the rest of the other members. The other theme was size matters. So thinking about including the really small and sponsored members more, since it's such a growing group. So clearly the outreach is working, but how can we get them really more involved in the community, and also thinking about how we can involve them in the board, and that was noted that there's a lot of attention spent on the larger members, but because of the large volume. And there could be, sort of looking forward to the future, more emphasis on the metadata use and users, as we also just heard. So we think that one really positive step that Crossref made in the last years was to end the sort of opt-out metadata use. So really rethinking what is metadata. Metadata is there to share. Metadata should be publicly available. And so I think that already those kinds of discussions have been taking place, and that's something that can move forward. And again, thinking about, we were asking how much of this time is proactive versus reactive. So how much of the time are you a help desk, and how much of the time are you really reaching out to new potential members?
So we have more questions than answers, really. As has already been said, it was really hard to think about this question about the future, knowing whether Crossref was set up right, given that we don't have a good sense of what that future looks like. So there was a question around the table about actually who sets that, who is responsible for that kind of vision for the organization. If, for example, there's some people working on that, it's not clear from the website that that's happening. So that was one area of uncertainty that made it difficult. Another was around just a sense of more information about who the membership is in terms of geography, in particular because of this explosive growth that's been seen over recent years in the very small category. Where are they? And just kind of being clearer about that. Around business models, around fields. Asia clearly is just missing, so on the board, for example, so that just seems like something that needs to be addressed. But also there are other groups that aren't represented, and given the kind of future that is being talked about, it seems like metadata users, funders, platform providers, and so on, you know, that there's a place for these people or these types of groups. There was a little bit of debate about this issue of the representation of the very large publishers on the board and whether that's right. There was a difference of opinion about that. And then in some cases, people feel that they're just unable to judge actually about whether the board is right because they don't have much knowledge of the people on the board and what they're thinking and what they're what they're doing and so on. So it's really hard for some members to really make any judgment about that. And I'm not quite sure what you do about that, but with such a huge and diverse membership, you can't really expect the board to do that on its own. So maybe there are some other mechanisms that are needed to fulfill that need.
So we're echoing many of the same points that came out. Who are the future membership? Who are the future representatives of Crossref? There's as Table 5 said, there's a massive growth from the small member community. How is that being represented? Who are the stakeholders and members of the future? Can we start to begin to identify them and bring them into the conversation now? And the big thing that's, again, missing, that's come up in a number of other things, is the data consumers are not included anywhere, the people who actually really use the data. And how is Crossref incorporating their views? And we're talking about researchers, libraries, institutions, funders, from all over the world, whether it's academies, learning societies, or however that wants to work out. The governance, and this was, again, about basically the same thing. The board does not include consumers, any any stakeholder from that consumer group. Again, it lacks the representation that others have been talking about in terms of diversity. Again, speaking to, well, what is the future? We don't know that. And there seems to be no committee or working groups actually working on what is the future, what are the gaps, and where are we missing? We need working groups on how to identify and engage with strategic partners, including infrastructure partners. Who are the organizations that Crossref needs to be working with? How does that collaboration work? What's that role in the future? And again, also looking at completely different alternative revenue sources. And again, not from the content creators, but from the content users. How can... is there a mechanism by which institutions and funders, and again, this was spoken to about yesterday, can contribute financial support to Crossref as an organization because the users are getting so much benefit? Does that cover everything? Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you, Brian, for getting creative with the slides. We started by looking at the growth in sponsored members, really impressive growth from the table pack. And some concern about the impact of this on the infrastructure and operations of Crossref. How sustainable is this if it continues at the rate that it's doing? But there was also concern about the amount of time that's spent with larger publishers, also from the information in the pack. And this is about the changing profile of Crossref. It's about how it was set up as a publisher organisation with a small number of large publishers, and that's changed over time, and it's continuing to change. And we saw a real tension here between how Crossref is changing as a membership organisation and how this is being represented on the board at the moment and through the different structures of the Crossref organisation. So the new parts of the community, such as funders and researchers and the metadata consumers, want to have a voice at the table, and they want to be able to change and influence things, and there's no way for them really to do that at the moment through the formal structures of Crossref. So the question is, how do we represent that wide and changing constituency, and how do we let them steer Crossref? So we discussed new types of membership, maybe a public membership, getting different advisory groups together to help steer Crossref. But we definitely feel that Crossref is on a journey from where it started, and there was a lot of support around the table for improving the representation and widening it away from the initial base forming Crossref. Great. So it was quite a difficult discussion to start off with. It's a big question. I think it's really interesting listening to all the groups, how these themes are coming out.
So we believe that nomination of the members for the committees shall be more clear and more transparent, because we are positive that people in the board, in the committees do a lot, but we probably wish to see more of their background. Probably the second thing that working and advisory groups should be remained to give more understanding to the people what they are all about. So the next thing that Crossref shall be more involved with other groups. That means the same as the people said already. Should attract the libraries, the smaller publishers, and the rest who are the interest of Crossref. So probably the way out of this is that within Crossref, one big publisher shall be elected, which will kickstart the process and which will lead the process, and the rest will follow this idea. And the other thing is open call for committee participation for the general Crossref members to know what's going on in the organization. Thank you.
So yeah, there does seem to be a common thread here, and there were more questions than answers when we were looking at is Crossref poised for the future? What is that future? Where is that vision? We don't know what that vision statement is. So how do we respond to that question? How do we prepare if we don't have a clear view? Somebody else in our group also mentioned perhaps there should be a committee working on that, or clarity if there is somebody working on it now. And how is Crossref talking to users about the future? And then who are the users? Who is the future? The emerging types, publishers, university, library publishers, researchers, funders, they're not really represented when we think about the complexion of the board and the committees. I mean, there were no sponsored organizations on the board. Sorry. There were no, I'm almost done. There were no sponsored organizations on the board, and that was noted as a gap. And then another part when we were talking about like how much time is spent on the publishers, Yvonne brought up a different point. What are we working on? How much time is spent on today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, or yesterday? So.
There was a very sort of basic thing about, the board and the committees, there's no real discussion. They're needed because of the structure of Crossref, etc. So maybe they should almost have a little bit less prominence and more prominence given over to the working groups and the advisory committees, etc. And I think there does need to be something more explicit stated about the nature of the organisation for some people, because the non-profit is understood by some as what that stands for and means, but for others it isn't. So I think maybe some clarity there would be good. So there was this whole thing about the board composition, about the fact that sponsoring organisations don't have a voice, broadening out and using the structure to support and represent small members. And I don't think it has been refreshed for us either, but it's okay. There was this tension as well about staff time spent on the large publishers, and can Crossref scale effectively to support these small publishers. In the working advisory groups, there was this issue about the tension between Crossref concentrating on its basic services, which many of its members wants it to do, and Crossref focusing on innovation, which others in the community would like it to do. So there was this sort of pull and tension here. And there was a discussion about whether there was a need to have a more structured way to formalise the partnerships that it has with other organisations and the areas that it's reaching out into, and that maybe because of this tension between core business and new activities, it's important that it better explains the added value that comes with these initiatives, so that it's seen why you're involved in lots of other things, because it actually underpins the organisation as a whole. Otherwise, it can just be seen as a sort of excuse to go off and get involved here, there and everywhere. Okay. And our group also discussed much of what's been said before, so I won't go into that.
Yeah, we also talked a lot about diversification of the board. So it seems to us that it's really US, Europe, UK centered. I say Europe, UK. I don't know if I have to say that already, but anyway, the representation of the board should be more diverse, and we also think geographically. In the current representation, you also see people listed, and then there is a location, and it's not well done in the sense that the organization is somewhere else than where the persons are. So you have to take care what you put in the geographical location. We think that, like the other said, missing is the metadata consumers, and we think the scientists, for example, the scientists that were also present and are present here, they have a very big interest in what Crossref is doing as a consumer, and they could be represented in the board or in committees and feed back to what kind of services they would like to see, and also actively develop with Crossref the services that we would like to have and that would be very functional. For example, Ludo. There is a lot of interactions, but the interactions is just not formalized in a sense, and it should probably be more formalized. If there are committees, then there could possibly also be a committee of metadata users, was one of the proposals in our group. Then the staff time, we briefly touched on that, and it was more like staff is spending a lot of time on big publisher issues and who have lots of registrations as well. And there is a tension there between how much they pay big publishers. If the volume of registrations is going up and up all the time, then they will pay more and more. So there is a definite need for reassessing the income model, the whole model, but that is the topic of the next round, I think. So did I miss out anything? No? Okay.
There are two problems we should take into consideration. The first one is a lack of diversity. My colleagues, right, there is no board member from Asia. Our represented members from China never vote. The real small publishers have no chance to be represented by the board. And they suggest, could you enrich the board? And you can see, there are no representatives from users, libraries, researchers, founders, outside of industry altogether. And the second very interesting idea, small publishers are not smallest. Crossref should reflects that small publisher category costs to a broad net. The second problem is about no mention of user community. My colleagues, right, Crossref clearly serves their members. There is nothing about the user community, librarians, researchers, founders. We need to understand their use cases and needs better. In turn, helps publishers better serve them. For example, a new products services committee might be, and then let me. My colleagues discussed the second thing. Possibly there is misleading categorization of publishers. For example, library, university, when in fact these are just publishing subunits. So they say that, sorry. We should consider the notion of working groups, which are separate from formal board and committees, but which are more accessible and which cover a lot more operational activity. They should be promoted, as it is largely unknown how they are formed and how they operate. Also, working groups page has not been updated since January 2013. Thank you.
What were you surprised by? I'm sure everybody's going to say the same thing for at least probably all of these. First of all, that incredible growth in the proportion of revenue from the smallest tier from 2011 to 2019, which I think we all knew there'd been very strong growth, but I think actually seeing it, 1,000 to 11,000 was astonishing. But we were also surprised by the lack of growth in the middle. So the top's obviously very stable, and those top 6 or 7 organisations are actually probably getting bigger, and we speculated that some of the reason for lack of growth in the middle is because they've sort of sucked in some of those smaller to medium-sized publishers through acquisitions, and that's why there hasn't been as much growth as perhaps we would have expected. But we did think that there might be opportunities for Crossref with looking at that sort of middle group of publishers and organisations. And then we were also surprised by the fact that the membership fees and content registration fees haven't changed, at least in that 2011 to 2019 period. So that seems like a long time to go without any increase at all in fees, and maybe is another opportunity. And then what we would change, we thought that the proportion of revenue from content registration, maybe there should be a sort of a shift towards metadata usage. We're also concerned about the content registration fees, that maybe they're not working for all communities. Difficult at the top end because of volume issues, it's, $1 or $2 per DOI or whatever is fine if you're publishing, in the hundreds, but once you get into the thousands and tens of thousands, then it becomes very expensive. Also potentially an issue maybe for the funding community. One of our table members is representing that community, and there's some resistance to paying that sort of per fee amount for a grant DOI, so that might suppress the opportunities there. But also, at the moment, Crossref waives the content registration fee for the very lowest income publishers, and so maybe that means it's not working at that end of the scale either. So perhaps revisiting that would be a good idea. And then, sorry to be repetitive, as this I'm sure is going to come up again and again, but it did make us think yet again that the board's representation isn't really representing where the revenue comes from at the moment. So I know that's just been revisited, but maybe it needs revisiting some more in the light of these conversations.
The first one is also the small-large tension, which becomes very clear if you look at the numbers. Actually, it is 11 versus 11,000. If you look well, it's 11 members that bring in 35% of the revenue. It's also 11,000 members at the other end of the scale, the small ones, who bring in 35%. No income from anything that's usage-based. There was some discussion. Users of metadata who are commercial could contribute. Users of metadata who do not also register themselves could perhaps contribute. And then there was also a surprise worth mentioning, low overall costs. In itself, Crossref is not such a big or expensive organization. What is the one thing we would change? Well, you see 4, so we couldn't quite agree, but we want to mention them all. The first is balancing risks. If so much of your revenue comes from only 11 members, what do you do if they suddenly start building their own solution? Because probably they provide enough to start doing that. B is in line with that. Maybe a fixed price per DOI is not so logical because there's not a real cost associated to giving out more DOIs. There's also a demand for more DOIs per article, on images, on citations, on research data, etc. There was a real concern about the cost per item increasing. We put a few graphs together. That is, if you look at staff costs and the number of items deposited, the real growth is in the number of journals, but they bring less items. So that means that every item that is registered is more complex, and that probably explains that 80% of staff time goes to the smaller organizations. That's also in number D, staff time. There seems to be no economy of scale if the additional items are more complex.
One of the things that we also noticed was that there had been no price increase on anything, either DOI registration or fees for from 2011 and probably earlier. Oh, could you close that and reopen it, because that's not the most recent one? Oh, okay. No? As well, of course, I think everybody will mention that that it was also quite surprising that the smaller publishers are really collectively paying now more than the large publishers. The other thing that we also noted was that the metadata users are a very small part of the revenue. So somebody mentioned similarity check, that Crossref hadn't been participating in that revenue, but that is now changing so that the Crossmark feature can now be fee-free. And the suggestions that we made were, on the one hand, you've got this fantastic database, so could more paid services for metadata users be developed, like analytics? So both you could ask for more money from metadata users, but maybe you also need to provide more services around that. And you could use this to basically also start subsidizing some of that content registration fees, but we also discussed having sort of incentives or discounts for depositing rich metadata. So publishers who were depositing abstracts, license information, ORCIDs, funding information, that those records are basically more valuable to metadata users downstream. So those publishers should get some kind of a discount. We also had the idea that one could introduce a paying non-member supporter category to get institutions a bit more on board. And also there was a suggestion that the tiers structure could be reconsidered, because maybe the lowest tier, which is from $0 to $1 million, that covers a pretty big span. So maybe that could be broken up a little bit, and some of the middle tiers could be put together, because there seems like a lot of tiers for a very few number of publishers. Yeah.
So there are definitely some themes emerging. Oh, that's not, can you refresh that, please? Thank you. Because we decided when we looked at it, we weren't sure what the first one was, so we got rid of it. Not surprisingly, the explosive growth in small members was definitely seen as a surprise. And that led to the question of in relation to the fees, where this data about pricing parity sort of suggested that this could well be a massive barrier in some areas. Is the explosive growth actually counteracting that? So, trying to understand that more would be a good thing. We got into a bit of a circular discussion about the sponsoring member issue, and so there still seems to be a lot of confusion about exactly how that works, although there was, there's a lot more of that, and there's a recognition that it's helpful. So there was also some surprise around the way that margins have both decreased a little bit in recent years, but also just about the level of what those margins are, and whether there is some kind of expectation around what the margin should be, which would help to then mitigate that sense of surprise. In terms of suggestions, one thing that we thought would be helpful would be to just look at the fee structure and try to review the rationale. If it hasn't changed for years and years, is it still the right kind of structure? And to consider options such as a more equitable fee structure, taking account of these geographic considerations, which seem particularly important now. But also, even more radical ideas like a single membership fee, for example. And then there's definitely, it just looks like there are opportunities to diversify revenues. And one of the things that keeps coming up is this idea around metadata services, where there's clearly some really nice growth being seen, despite the fact that actually they're not being promoted that heavily. And so, the idea of putting much more effort into building revenue on the basis of those services, that there could be a lot of potential in that.
The same themes, what surprised us, who's paying what? So I still think it's, the smallest tier, that is surprising as well, and the growth there. But the fact that 11 publishers are still providing a third of the revenue is a huge reliance on 11 publishers supporting Crossref. And I think there's an imbalance there that needs to be looked at. The smallest tier, the smallest 3 tiers are 46%. That is a large chunk of the revenue. But one of the questions we wanted to know is there a threshold for the growth in those number of small members? Is there an expectation that will just keep growing? And we know that revenue is not scaling at the moment, but what's that going to look like? Then the second thing is a massive revenue generation imbalance. So there's no or little revenue generation from the metadata users, and total reliance on revenue from the content generators. And again, what Alice was talking about, Alice's table, why there's so few members in the middle. Who's there? Does this actually really reflect the industry and what's out there? And if it doesn't, who's missing? And where are they? And so if there was one thing we could change, well, we've got 3 things. How do we embed incentives for the providers of the metadata to make that metadata better quality, more open, and to give them? And at the moment, there is no incentive. They're providing the data, they're paying the fees. There's very little incentives there for those actually generating them, even if that the cost of that is being passed on to those paying for publications. And we need to work out a fee structure for metadata users. And this isn't about charging them for the data, but it's about a membership fee for them. It could be even something like subscribe to open, although I don't like that term. But Clarivate relies on this data. How much are they contributing? How much financial support are they prepared to give to Crossref? What about Wellcome? What about institutions? And what about those ephemeral entrepreneurs that come in, try something, might subscribe for a year but don't? What's the fee structure around that? And then again, this has also come up. Is what's the role of these sponsoring members and organizations? And there seems to be confusion at the moment. So sponsoring members get to vote, but sponsoring organizations don't get to vote. And so can there be more focus, or can we enhance the role of sponsoring members and organizations per se, and take it off the actual small member or the small entities that make up those groups? And then, if that's so, how do we give them more ownership, more voting rights, and more governance? I think that was about it. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me start with what we weren't surprised with. We weren't surprised at the absolute levels of revenue for Crossref. We thought that was about right for a company of this size and what we were doing. We looked at the growth in operating expenses from 2018 to 2019 and discussed that reflect the focus on staffing and investment in projects that Crossref was doing. But we were surprised about that increase in operating expenses. We were surprised about the decrease in revenue for, I'm not quite sure what T2 is. Oh, sorry, Turnitin. Thank you. Mr. Turnitin. We were surprised about the decrease for revenue for Turnitin, and this reflects and we wondered why Turnitin would want to do that, would want to have a decreased revenue, and it reflects the fact that Crossref are now taking over a lot of the administration and management of the service on behalf of members with Turnitin. Surprised about the lack of reserves, and felt that should be close to a year's worth of revenue, and it's currently about half of that level. We were surprised that Crossref as an organisation doesn't know what the market penetration for its services is. We were looking at the growth with small publishers and the growth in the number of DOIs being registered, and wondered from that how much of the market have we penetrated, how much growth can we expect here, and what percentage of revenue we should also expect from preprints. So looking at what we could change, the fee structure for developing countries was something that came across many of our discussions today, and looking at the break between the balance between fee level and DOI registration, and we discussed perhaps a global fund to allow participation from the smallest group of publishers. We also discussed predatory publishers and whether Crossref needs to do something to ensure that publishers, I wasn't allowed to use predatory, fraudulent journals weren't providing a revenue stream for Crossref, and some concern there. I think that's me. That's covered it. Thank you.
What surprised us? The funding model, which is going back to the year 2000 to support a small group of large publishers, we believe that in current conditions, this model could be rethinking and changing. The second thing, there is a visible breakdown of core and non-core activities in the financial streams. So this is clearly seen in the report. The numbers, they see that operating expenses are growing together as revenue. This is the third thing our table found surprising. So what we can change, if we could, we think that that would be a good idea to cooperate closely with our other DOI providers, such as DataCite, for example, and make more, as a result, make more balanced model of pricing and revenuing. So the second one is changing per volume of metadata use, and the third one, the third point is to probably it will be a good idea to think about building a model for the future infrastructure. Beyond the DOIs themselves. That means that charging from a registration fee for access and usage fee. Thank you.
We weren't surprised by anything. Perhaps that's because there are a couple of us that are on the M&F committee, but perhaps not. Maybe we just weren't paying that close attention.
Do you want to?
I'm sorry? Just hold it closer to my mouth. I apologize. So we also did not come up with one thing we would change, even though we didn't spend a lot of time about what we weren't surprised about. We had concern over the purchasing power parity that's been discussed a lot and that I know has been under discussion at Crossref for some time for like the sponsored organizations and the sponsoring organizations. Don't have an answer, but it's one thing that we know needs to be looked at. We talked about aligning the vision and the fees. If the mission is a value to the publisher, the balance looks fair. But if we look at who benefits, well, who benefits, it would make sense for the Metadata Plus users. I mean, as everyone has already been saying, trying to get the metadata users to pay some more of what's going on, and it also diversify the revenue streams. We talked about Metadata Plus instead of free versus the SLA, distinguishing between commercial and non-commercial users. And then who are the users? Again, for the people who aren't using Metadata Plus, we don't really know who they are. They could contribute financially, but also, as someone else mentioned, have some sort of membership for them so that they have a say. And then someone also noted the sponsorship, the GDP criteria should be updated.
I have to say that fees are not my thing. I'm not good at counting, but there's been some creative accounting already, so please forgive me for the extra lines we have up here. If we look at subscriber services, we're a very diverse group. For some, the fact that it was at about 9% of revenue was a surprise in a positive sense, and for others it was a surprise in a negative sense, so I think that plays out with what's been said by others. Again, for some of us on the table, complexity of fees was a little bit of a barrier, but for others it was fairly obvious, so I think it depends where we're coming from. This comment came particularly from someone who has a role of both a consumer and a depositor, but there is a discrepancy in the ratio of costs between 1 and 20. The contribution of the small publishers to the total revenue, I think, again, that's been picked out by several people, but this hasn't been said yet, and I think, it's an important remark that there's missing a particular line for R&D costs expenses, and that could be an important signal to both members and to others outside of the organisation. So if there was one thing we could change, there were 4. Reassess the fee structure to be better in line with the mission. However, there was a caveat here that actually it works. So maybe we should be careful about what we want to change. That we should be exploiting in the positive sense the small member market to readdress a little bit the balance. But we have to remember as well that there are administrative costs associated to that explosion there of having more small members, so that should be borne in mind. It was acknowledged about the waiver for geographical areas, and there was the proposal that there should perhaps also be tiers for others, so not just a single cost. And then there was a suggestion to review the current cost of registration fees across the board, in particular related to the DOI, which has remained stable across the years, but probably has become less costly in terms of overall costs. Perhaps it should be lower. So that was also proposed.
We also saw a big jump in the similarity check income, but it was explained how that came about letting drop the other services and then having to pay for the software services. The big jump in the revenue from the low tier and the high tier, that there is much more income from the low tiers, that was obvious, of course. But what we thought also is that it's not very clear how many registrations are in the different tier groups. So if you go to this page 18, it would be very good if you could have there see what kind of registrations were done per tier. Then you have more insight in what's going on, and you can also analyze those groups a bit better. Then there is a big imbalance, 10-to-1 imbalance in the relationship between the content registration and the metadata users, was one of the remarks. What should we change in terms of revenues? I think the deeper analysis of the 275 category could bring some insightful facts where you could perhaps adapt some fees and have some adjustments. And also perhaps more revenue from the users, like other tables have said as well. But we more focus then on the fact that you can ask more for the extra services that are provided. And you can, if you have more kinds of services that you are developing, you can see what you can ask for those kind of services, and perhaps also different fees for different parties, depending on they are commercial or not.
Can I ask a clarifying question? What do you mean the imbalance in the relationship? Revenue.
Yeah, the revenue, eh? That's just... The revenue, yeah, okay.
We have got a question from Crossref. Does anything surprise us about Crossref's revenue streams? I should say a lot. So much revenue from content registration. There are so many services my colleagues have no idea about. Top-tier membership has remained flat, while lowest membership tier has surged in. And the most interesting, Crossref, being a non-for-profit organization, is so financially healthy. It's a surprising thing for us. And the second question is, if there was one thing you could change about Crossref's revenue streams, what would it be? Sorry. Let me sit. The first one, my colleagues recommend to increase the amount of revenue that Plus is generating, possibly through pricing. Emphasize and educate about added value of services in order to increase uptake. More services directly benefiting members instead of those that indirectly benefit members. And more systematic service of membership to understand changing needs. So, crowning up the ideas, I should say, we have got 3 insights. The first one is metadata services commercialized in a way that supports sustainability of Crossref. Is there an opportunity to get more revenue from commercial entities benefiting from metadata? And the second one is the following. Emphasizing added value of services to existing members would likely increase their willingness to use these services. And the third one, there should be more research, investigations, surveys, providing by Crossref staff devoted to the needs of your members' clarification. Thank you.
This may be a very naive point, given the emphasis that's been placed on it by everyone else speaking in the room. But there's been a lot of concern that I've heard that the costs are increasing at the same rate as the revenue. And it occurs to me that this may be something that's appropriate for a non-profit organisation, because the non-profit should be doing more as the revenue increases rather necessarily than increasing its margin and making a bigger surplus. So I just want to throw that out there as an alternative viewpoint.
Paola Mazzucchi from Italian Publisher Association and another DOI registration agency. I just wanted to pose, well, a question or a point of discussion on all the topics. On one side, we've been saying that there's the need to enlarge the representation and the membership to users, for example, and so that everyone has to have a say. On the other side, to make the organization sustainable, we are in a way advocating to have some categories of users, the same category we are asking, we were wondering they became members, to pay more. Isn't this a kind of clash that should be considered very carefully before changing anything on the fee structure and sustainability model?
I actually wanted to comment on the previous comment over here. I think it's a very good point. But I think the question is which is driving which, right? Is it the increasing cost that's allowing the expenses to increase unchecked? Or is it increasing expenses of providing the services that are forcing the revenue to drive up, right? So I don't think there's a clear view of which way around that is, and that's quite an important thing to understand, I think.
Okay, just wanted to make 2 comments really in regards to, Katrina Hindawi. In terms of the increasing operating costs, there may well be a transitional cost that is extra as this whole bit is shifting, but I agree we need to know where those costs are coming from. The second point was just there were several tables who commented about a fee structure based on commercial or non-commercial use of the services. And I just wanted to, I work for a commercial company, but to raise a caution about this because it reminds me of the debate about text and data mining of the access of content. And that one of the arguments about having a non-commercial Creative Commons license was so that commercial users could be charged more for text and for mining that content than non-commercial users, even though they were subscribing to that content. I think there's a point of principle here that if we want innovation, if we want that all players to be equal, so those using the metadata, regardless of whether they're commercial or non-commercial entities, should be allowed to mine that. So, for example, if a large publisher wants to come in, a large commercial publisher, and use the data in a way that might be noticed, and that just because they're commercial, they shouldn't be charged more. So it's trying to sort of, I'm just trying to make the consistency or raise that issue about consistency of arguments in terms of we're charging for services, not for the actual data and the content, and it's yeah, there's an issue.
I just forgot one remark, and that is that the data are there in some graphs, but the underlying data are not available. And so it would be a very good, is a suggestion from one of our table, that if those data are available, that anybody can use them for visualizations and for give us a better insight on what's going on the fees and all these kind of things. And the other thing is that the graph on 21, there is an error in it, because it seems as if there is a complete going down in the 550 category. But if you see, it's just going up. It's just, it's more than the 400,000 there in the table. In a sense, I think we should also really recheck all those data, because if you go to the last one, the lowest tier, and you calculate the 10,000 or 11,000 members times the fee, it goes over the amount that is listed at the site. But you can perhaps explain.
Yeah, so we had a request on this table, which I thought was really interesting, about making the data available so people can analyze it and double check it. Because of the sponsoring programs, the number of members doesn't correlate directly in that bottom category. So I think that is correct, but we can double check that. And I think because we've assigned a DOI to this, we can issue a correction and update the metadata, right? And follow best practice there. But yeah, I mean, happy to have more questions, but I did just kind of want to maybe make a few reflections here before we break for lunch, and just really to say, I mean, thank you so much for all your contributions so far this morning, and I'm really looking forward to this afternoon, and just amazing stuff, you know. And we've got a lot of really great ideas and questioning and challenging things, so really making us think, and I think that's really positive. So thank you, thank you very much. And what's been interesting is maybe, you know, there are some themes that are coming up from the different tables, and I think this whole area about metadata users paying more, you know, and I think that's something that has already happened, but clearly that's been a theme that really could shift the model there, and I was, you know, and that's an interesting question, because we can charge more for metadata based on the services, right? So we can improve the service, and we have plans to do that. But a driver of that is better metadata as well, right? And so the more metadata we have from publishers, the more valuable it is, right? So now there's more abstracts, ORCID IDs, funding information. That's all really critical to driving the value of that. So that is sort of a circle. It's connected, right? And I think that you have the content registration, which is obviously supporting metadata delivery, and we have members who are on both sides of that equation, and you know, maybe they'll wind up paying more for the metadata out, and that would be a positive a development. So I think that's definitely an area we're going to be looking at. And I think we had an interesting discussion on our table about trying to quantify the value that members get from the metadata out, because in some of the discussion, you know, it's as if they're two separate things. Well, obviously metadata dissemination, metadata getting out there, is all about the member content, right? And we see how the funders find value in it, and things like that publishers are supporting, like Chorus and Scalex, are driven by this metadata. So I think that's always important, to remember. But one point I did want to make in the balance of the fees. It's the balance of the fees are the way they are by design, right, on purpose. But we're hearing a lot, and it's useful to question and saying, does that need to change? But at the time, the fees were set up with very consciously in the way that they're done. But clearly things change, and those fees have really not changed, as some people noted, since 2004, I think, was the last time we made a change to the fees. So clearly a huge amount has changed. So it's definitely worth looking at that. Another couple of things came up on our table that I think tie in with a few other things is that there's a per DOI fee that's a one-time fee. And those DOIs, there's a commitment for them to persist forever, right? So have we factored that into our calculations of ongoing costs? Because a publisher pays once, and that DOI exists forever, and metadata updating, there's no extra charge for it. So there's kind of looking at balancing those out, and looking at that persistence issue. The other thing is the complexity of the metadata that we collect. There are more relationships, more other identifiers, and I think that touches on economies of scales and efficiencies, and of course something that we're looking at really closely. But what we collect now is much more extensive and more complicated. That affects Crossref, it affects our members as well. And again, I think we have to think about that a little bit. And then clearly there's been a huge amount around representation and the diversity of the membership and the community, and lots of really good ideas of what we have to look at through there. So those were just some of my observations from the morning, and then we've got a little bit more this afternoon, but.